Thanks, everyone. We'll give it another minute and then we can get started. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Manoj Govindaya. I'm an attorney with Immigrant Legal Defense. I'm joined by my colleague, Eleni Wolfer-Bottas, also from Immigrant Legal Defense. She will be helping with the Q&A. Eleni, do you want to mention questions and all that?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. We hope this will be helpful to you to get this conversation going. One note, this is the beginning of the conversation, as Manoj is going to talk about. This is going to be a changing information. So this information is current as of today, but as we'll talk about, please make sure you're continuing to stay informed and stay in touch as things change. All of the questions, if you could type them into the Q&A, only the panelists will see them, so it'll remain anonymous. And then at the end of the presentation, I will read the questions without anybody's name being revealed, and try and summarize them a bit to Manoj so we can make sure that they're getting answered. But again, no one will see the Q&A other than us, the panelists, so please feel free to put in any questions that you have there. Thanks.
All righty. So we are going to chat with you today about President Biden's announcement from earlier this week, and try to clarify what we know, what we don't know. As Eleni mentioned, this is a quickly changing situation, and very little information has actually been provided. So we really just want to make sure folks understand what is out there, what is not out there, and what we're still waiting to hear about. Just briefly about our organization, Immigrant Legal Defense is a nonprofit legal services organization based in Oakland. We provide free immigration legal services at 9 Cal State campuses and 34 community college campuses. We, in addition to other projects and work that we do, for the CSU and California community college campuses, all of our services are free of charge, confidential, and they include nearly all type of immigration casework, except business and employment related visas. So what exactly did President Biden do? So on June 18th, so a couple of days ago, he announced 2 immigration actions. They're not new necessarily, but they're a direction of current immigration policy, and sort of a redirection of current immigration policy. So we're going to talk through both of these. The first one were new benefits for qualifying spouses and children of U.S. citizens. And the second is improved access to employment-based visas for DACA holders and dreamers. So starting with the new benefits for spouses and children of U.S. citizens. As Eleni mentioned, as I mentioned, this information is changing. and very little information has been provided. So what I'm going to emphasize now for the next couple of slides is what the Department of Homeland Security and what President Biden has actually told us and what they have yet to tell us. So we can just kind of get through what we know and what is unknown. So parole in place is the benefit that President Biden has recently extended. And so that would be available to spouses and stepchildren of US citizens who meet certain criteria. I want to emphasize that this is a huge win for the immigrant community. Parole in place is considered to be equivalent to a lawful entry. So if somebody entered the US without permission, often they are not eligible to get permanent residency or get a green card here, and they may have to return to their country of origin, which could create all kinds of complications for their case. But parole in place essentially serves the function of a lawful entry, which means if a person is married to a US citizen or has a US citizen step parent, they would be able to get a green card here in the US without needing to leave. If someone is granted parole in place under the June 18th announcement, they would receive it for 3 years, during which time that person presumably would apply for permanent residency. And during that 3-year period, they would also be eligible for employment authorization. So they would be eligible for work permits. So the criteria that's been released is spouses and stepchildren of US citizens that have been living in the United States for at least 10 years as of June 17th, that last entered the United States without permission. So if someone entered the US legally, they would not be eligible for this new option that President Biden explained on June 18th. They need to have been legally married to a US citizen or have a qualifying stepchild relationship with the US citizen as of June 17th. And they cannot have certain criminal history or pose a threat to national security or public safety. And I do want to emphasize that it's a case-by-case determination. So that means you still have to show, even if you meet all this criteria, you still have to show that you merit or you deserve discretion, is kind of the key word to get parole in place granted for you. So what have they not told us? So they have not told us when applications will start being accepted, which means applications are not currently being accepted. The guidance has simply said later this summer. They have also not told us the specific criteria or the application process. The guidance does say regulations are forthcoming. Regulations go through a review period. Often there's a 30 or 60-day comment period before final regulations are issued. So it may be several months before applications are actually accepted. They have not told us what documents will be required, and they have not told us what application form is required or what the filing fee would be. Their parole in place does currently exist for certain populations, and so we know what application form is used for parole in place currently. But if you recall, when DACA went into effect in 2012, a new application form accompanied DACA applications. We have no idea if there will be a new or different kind of application form specific for this type of parole in place. And that's unfortunately not something we can speculate on. So again, I want to emphasize, applications are not being accepted right now. The best estimate we have of when they might be accepted is exactly what DHS told us, which is later this summer. I also want to talk about the employment-based visa announcement for DACA and Dreamers. So what President Biden did is he directed the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State to work together to help qualifying individuals, quote, more quickly receive work visas. So DACA holders, for example, may be eligible for work visas, common work visas, or H-1B visas, or L-1s, or something along those lines. You may have heard of those. Um, Often people, to qualify for those visas, they may have to leave the US and apply for those visas at a consulate. Um, and so that process, applying at a consulate or a US embassy, may take a long time. And so more quickly receive work visas seems to suggest that they're looking for ways to speed up that process. So people can go abroad, apply for their work visa, and come back to the US in a relatively short amount of time. Who qualifies for this? DACA recipients and other dreamers who have earned a degree at a US institution of higher education in the United States and have received an offer of employment from a US employer in a field related to their degree for a high-skilled job. So what we don't know, what DHS has not told us, we don't know when this sped up process, this faster process will begin, or when applications will start being accepted. We don't know who qualifies as other dreamers. We don't know what steps are actually going to be taken to speed up the visa issuance process. We also don't know what type of degree will qualify, what type of job offer, part-time, full-time, salaried, hourly. We don't know any of that. And we don't know what type of higher education institution will qualify for this. We also don't know, like the parole in place, we don't know what the application process is, what application forms will be used, or what the filing fee is. So again, this is very preliminary. Again, the goal of today's presentation is to help you all understand that information is changing very quickly, and applications for parole in place or the employment-based visas really will not be available and won't be accepted until later this summer at the earliest. So nothing has started yet. I don't want to burst anyone's bubble because these are great announcements and they will have a huge impact on a large population. But there's nothing new to apply for as of today, as of June 21st. I think that's like the main thing I want to emphasize to you folks. What we think is going to happen. We do expect that once details about both of these programs, the parole in place and the DACA options, are released, when a start date has been announced, when regulations for the parole in place have been released, we do expect lawsuits to try to prevent the programs from going into effect. We we can't speculate on what those lawsuits will be, where they will be filed, what they're going to argue, but those lawsuits and the court decisions that come as a result of those lawsuits might shape the programs further, or unfortunately, they might prevent the programs from going into effect entirely. Again, I'm not trying to be a downer, but I really want to be realistic for everyone that it is June. There is a presidential election in November. The time frame that they've given for when these programs might go into effect is later this summer. We're sort of already halfway through summer. So I don't know when we'll see them go into effect and what might actually go into effect. I think it's going to be severely based on the result of court actions. So for these reasons, all the above reasons, we recommend that you continue pursuing any and all options currently available to you. We do not want you to think that the possibility of parole in place or the possibility of an employment-based visa is going to replace current possibilities that you might be eligible for. If anything, it should be viewed as an additional possibility. And we as immigration attorneys are consistently recommending that everyone apply for as much as they possibly can. So we want you to continue applying for whatever you're already on track to apply for. And if these options at some point in the future become viable and available to you, that's fantastic. And you apply for those too. And you run with whatever is going to be the best possibility for your specific situation. So I think all immigration attorneys, all immigration advocates have probably gotten a barrage of questions this week about the June 18th announcement. Here's a couple that our office has received from current or former clients. I'm married to a US citizen. Do I need to renew my DACA? Yes. We would recommend that you renew your DACA. Again, because parole in place, right now, it is speculative. We have so many unanswered questions. We don't even know when they'll start accepting applications, how long the application process is going to take, or any of that. We don't want you to lose DACA. You got to continue your DACA. Another question. I have DACA and I'm married to a US citizen. I don't want to continue with the process of applying for advanced parole, or my advanced parole was just granted, but now I don't want to travel because I can just apply for parole in place. We don't recommend that. We do recommend that you continue applying for advanced parole. And if you have advanced parole, we recommend that you move forward with your travel. Travel abroad, come back in with your advanced parole, and then you can move forward. We want you to continue on the existing paths that we know can work for people in your particular situations so that you are not missing out on any opportunity to get permanent relief. Another question. I was in a car and I was waved into the United States. They didn't check my passport or anything. They just let me in. I'm having trouble finding proof that I entered legally. Can I now apply for parole in place? This is a really fact-specific question, and I would strongly advise you to talk with your lawyer or speak with a lawyer to figure out whether you'd be eligible for parole in place. But generally speaking, someone in this scenario is considered to have legally entered the United States. And to be eligible for parole in place, you cannot have entered legally. You have to have entered without permission. So a person in this scenario probably is not eligible for parole in place and needs to focus on finding the proof of their legal entry so they can move forward with whatever it is they're trying to do. So our recommendation, can't emphasize it enough. Continue pursuing any and all options that are available to you under current law and under current policy. Because what President Biden has announced, what the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State are trying to do, it is speculative. And we don't know the timeline. We don't know when it's going to start. We don't know what the courts are going to do. So keep moving forward with what you have in place. Don't stop pursuing current existing options that are available to you. We want you to stay informed. This is rapidly changing. We do expect more information very soon from the government. Check our social media, ILD social media, for updates. We also, as we have committed in the past related to DACA, we're making the same commitment now that if there are any major announcements or any major changes to the June 18th announcement, we will commit to doing a webinar within 2 days to keep you all informed of what we know, what we don't know, and what the next steps might be. And lastly, we recommend that if you think you might be eligible for parole in place, if you have questions about eligibility, if you think you might be eligible for quicker employment-based visas for DACA holders or dreamers, or if you have any questions about your own situation, that you do a consultation with a reputable immigration attorney so you can identify all of your possible options and you can make the best decision for yourself. Again, please consult with a reputable immigration attorney about all of your options. Why should you talk to a lawyer? Well, lawyers are best positioned, reputable lawyers, immigration lawyers are best positioned to be able to answer any and all questions you might have about your immigration situation, about your immigration options, and about whether you might actually qualify for parole in place or faster employment-based visas. We do not want you to consult with or get legal advice from notarios or paralegals. Only immigration attorneys and only accredited representatives at recognized nonprofit organizations can legally give legal advice and representation. And no one can guarantee approval of anything in any immigration process, and no one can currently apply for these programs. No one can currently apply for parole in place under President Biden's announcement. No one is currently eligible for faster employment-based visas because applications are not being accepted for them yet. If somebody is giving you good news, like a notario, that's great. But just know you cannot apply for these yet. It's just not a possibility. So if someone is telling you, I will file an application for you for parole in place right now, today, don't believe it because it's not a possibility. They can't do it. And make sure you review every form and every document that you sign before you sign it. Make sure all the information is correct and make sure to ask for copies of it. I do encourage you, again, to speak with reputable attorneys. There are legal services available for all Cal State and all community college campuses, whether from ILD or other organizations like ILD. Again, these services are available in your best language. They're free and confidential. They're available regardless of your immigration status. And they're available to students, faculty, and staff at both the Cal States and the community colleges. And then additionally, for the Cal States, they're available for family members and recent alumni. If you attend one of these 9 CSU campuses, you can schedule an appointment with Immigrant Legal Defense with us. For the other 14 CSU campuses, you can visit this link or use this QR code to find which legal service provider serves your campus and schedule an appointment with them. And then for all community college campuses, you can schedule appointments through findyourally.com. Again, the consultations are free of charge. And you can get all of your questions answered and an individual personalized quality assessment on your options. Thank you for chatting with us. I am eager to hear your questions. I know I just covered a lot very quickly. But I think the main takeaway is these programs are great, and if and when they go into effect, they will help a lot of people. But it's if and when they go into effect. Nothing is in effect currently. We strongly recommend you continue down whatever path you're currently pursuing. Don't stop doing something because you think you might be eligible for this. And talk to reputable attorneys. Get quality information on what your options are. So let's jump into questions.
Thank you so much, Manoj, for that. And thank you all for your many very good questions. I'm trying to bucket them a little so that we can get to everyone's, but definitely keep them coming. And as you'll see, I've also answered some of your questions directly to you, so be sure to check. Thanks, Alonso, for putting the information in the chat for how individuals from the CSU, community college, or UC system can sign up for individual consultations. Again, as a reminder, if you have questions pertaining particularly to your case, facts, and situation, as Manoj mentioned, it's best to have an individual consultation with an attorney. And all of those services are free to you all and to family members. So please check out the links that Alonso shared in the chat or that I've sent to you individually. Okay, so a couple questions to get started. Do you think that this puts DACA at further risk of being eliminated since this has been announced? What do you think the interaction might be with that?
Wow, that's a big question.
Started you
Um,
with an easy one, just kidding.
I think DACA is in a court process, in a judicial process right now. I like to think that the courts are separating themselves from politics. So I personally would like to say that I don't think this new announcement will have an impact on the court's decisions related to DACA. Um, I think they also are covering different populations, at least the parole in place. I mean, a lot of people who might be eligible for parole in place may have DACA. Um, but DACA holders who have traveled on advanced parole don't necessarily need the parole in place to be able to get permanent residency through their spouse, U.S. citizen spouse. Um, I think politically, I don't know. I mean, I think this announcement that on June 18th is very politically driven. And what that means for the fate of DACA, I don't think they're intertwined necessarily, but they're certainly not completely separate. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm sorry.
I think it's definitely a start to the answer, and I think it's really hard to know. So, but yeah. Okay, another question is, can you clarify what parole in place is? There were a couple questions from people who traveled on advanced parole, and they are now worried that they won't be able to benefit from this potential change. So
Gotcha.
maybe to help explain that and why actually they're still able to benefit just in a different way.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So parole in play. So when somebody is outside of the US and trying to come into the US, there's sort of three main ways they can do it. One is by being admitted, meaning you've like shown a visa, shown your green card, and you are allowed in. One is by being paroled, which means you like physically are allowed into the US, but legally it's sort of as though you're still at the border. Um, and then one is by doing it without permission, entering without permission or without inspection. So advanced parole is kind of the middle category where you are physically in the US, but in many ways are kind of legally still at the border trying to be admitted to the United States. So advanced parole is for folks who traveled outside the US and then returned with advanced parole. Parole in place is kind of a way to be paroled, so falling sort of into that middle category, but not actually leaving the US. It's a way to be paroled while you're here domestically. Parole in place is currently an option for people who have loved ones that are in the military, and a family member of a military member might be eligible for parole in place. Um, Parole in place is also used for people that were victims of President Trump's family separation policy, around 2019, 2018. But it hasn't been, widespread use. Um, if so, parole in place is really only available to people whose last entry was without permission. If you have last entered on advanced parole, I think you're probably not. I don't quote me on this. I think I would need to research it to be sure, but I don't think you would be eligible for this parole in place option. Other attorneys might disagree with me, and like I said, I think I need to think that through a little bit more. But if you're not eligible for the parole in place option, that's potentially okay, because if you have traveled on advanced parole and you are married to a US citizen, you probably don't need the parole in place option. You can probably just apply for your green card here in the US because your most recent entry was with advanced parole.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Okay, another set of questions are, how can you prove that you entered without inspection?
Um, yeah, well, these are really good questions. Um, so I think generally if you, well, okay, if you have entered without inspection and you were not apprehended, then you're kind of presumed to have entered without inspection. If at any point in time, Border Patrol, whether at an airport or a seaport or a land port of entry, scanned anything related to you, a visa, a passport, your fingerprints, anything, there is likely going to be a record of it. And you can file a Freedom of Information Act request with Border Patrol to get proof of whatever that entry was. But apart from that, um, I don't know, Eleni, help me out here. But I think, if you have proof that you entered lawfully with permission, you don't need parole in place. You can just apply through your US citizen spouse for permanent residency. So really the only people that would need to show that they're eligible for parole in place are the ones who don't already have that lawful entry. If you have the lawful entry, you just skip the parole in place piece altogether and you just move forward with your green card application.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. This particular change is aimed at helping individuals who don't have a last entry that was lawful. In
Right.
terms of proving, it's kind of like proving a negative,
Yeah.
which is why I like the question. So if you don't have proof that you entered lawfully, that is the proof that you didn't enter lawfully. So I don't think you need to do more than that. Is there an age limit on stepkids?
So that's one I was thinking about when I was putting together the slides. So I think to be a stepchild, the marriage between your parent and your step parent needed to happen before you turned 18. So if your parent and step parent got married when you were 19, unfortunately, I don't think this is going to be a possibility for you. Um, I think the tricky thing is what happens if you are a step kid. So you meet that criteria where your parent and step parent married before you were 18, but you are now, 25 years old or something like that. I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens on that. But generally speaking, to immigrate to the US to get permanent residency as the child of a US citizen, whether stepchild or biological child or adopted child. Um, to do so, you need to be under 21 at the time the application is submitted. So my suspicion, but again, we don't have the guidance that we need to effectively answer your question. But my suspicion is if you are now over the age of 21, you probably will not be able to benefit from the parole in place option,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
that's likely correct. This is a very popular question. Can The gist of it is if you have a pending I-601A waiver, so you're married to a US citizen, I'm assuming, and you have a current waiver pending, can you benefit from this potentially if it goes into effect?
Right. So an I-601A waiver is for somebody who is trying to immigrate to the US, trying to get permanent residency through a spouse or a parent, and who does not qualify to do it here in the US. And so they need to go back to a foreign country to apply for their green card. Um, as I said during the presentation, when you leave the country, you may trigger certain bars, certain punishments, if you will. And the 601A waiver is an attempt to waive that punishment or kind of get a pardon of that punishment, so to speak. So I think if you are applying for an I-601A waiver through your US citizen spouse, and that person was a US citizen as of June 17th, then this parole in place option may give you the possibility of not needing to continue with the 601A waiver process and not needing to continue with consular processing, and would give you the possibility of applying for your permanent residency here in the US. But again, 601A waivers are available to many different kinds of family members, not just spouses of US citizens. And the parole in place possibility is only available for spouses of US citizens. So if you are applying for a 601A waiver based on your dad who has a green card or is a US citizen, that is probably still your only path forward, and you likely would not be eligible for this parole in place option. But again, we don't know when parole in place is going to move forward. We don't know how the courts might affect the eligibility criteria. However, we do know what the 601A waiver process looks like, and we do know what consular processing looks like. And so we would encourage you to continue with that process until there is more information released on parole in place and until you can ensure that you would benefit from it.
Okay, then there's a bucket of questions about basically for the DACA related thing. What does dreamer mean? Do you have to have DACA to benefit from that? How do you, do you have to, basically, do you have to currently have DACA? Does initial DACA count if it's pending or if you miss the cutoff? What do we know about what that means?
So I don't know, unfortunately. The guidance all says DACA, and other dreamers. And one of the things that DHS has not told us is who qualifies as an other dreamer. So I don't know if it's people who would meet the DACA requirements or who do meet the DACA requirements, but for the court decisions that have prevented the government from accepting initial applications, or if it would meet, the expanded DACA requirements that President Obama tried to do many years ago. Unfortunately, we just don't know. But the way the Department of Homeland Security's guidance is written as DACA and other dreamers makes us think that DACA holders is one group and then other dreamers is another group. So I don't think you have to have DACA to qualify as an other dreamer. I think it's going to be a larger group of people than just current DACA holders.
I think that's right. Then there's a set of questions proposing what that definition may mean. I think we're not going to go through all of those possible, but wonderful ideas. I think, like Manoj said, we're waiting to see, but we are hopeful it will be beyond just the definition of a current DACA holder. How does this proposed policy interact with someone who has TPS?
Yeah, great question. So TPS, TPS is not considered an admission. So I think if you entered the United States without permission, however many years ago, and then applied for and received TPS here in the US, I think you're still eligible for parole in place. If you wanted to pursue that, and assuming you're married to a US citizen and meet all the other criteria. Of course, if you have TPS, you are eligible to travel outside of the US. You are eligible to apply for a TPS travel document, which is functionally similar to advanced parole, like what DACA holders are eligible for. And so you're eligible to travel with a TPS travel document, return to the US, resume your TPS status, and now you have a lawful entry. And then you can just apply for your permanent residency through your US citizen spouse. What parole in place would give you is the possibility of applying for permanent residency domestically without needing to travel. But I do think if a TPS holder entered without permission, and they meet all the other requirements, then yes, they would probably be eligible for this parole in place.
Yeah, I think so too. There's a whole series of questions about if you have to leave the US to benefit from both proposed programs.
Sure. So if you're potentially benefiting from the parole in place possibility, the whole purpose of the parole in place is to avoid the need to leave the US. Um, so if you are eligible for the parole in place possibility and you apply for it whenever it's available at some point in the future, and you receive it, you would immediately, like the moment you receive the approval, you are now immediately eligible to apply for your permanent residency. Again, assuming you meet the requirements of permanent residency. Um, for the DACA employment-based option, I I don't know if you would need to leave the US, um, because we don't really know what changes they're making or what they're trying to do to speed up the process. However, most likely, because the guidance they've provided does talk about joint actions between the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State, I think it's probably specifically referring to people that are here in the US with DACA or other dreamers who would be going abroad. So you would be traveling outside of the US to apply for your employment-based visa and then returning to the US, presumably with your visa.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think there's a series of questions about how that interacts with DACA advanced parole and what that will do. So I think these are all related that unfortunately we just don't have the details to know exactly how that will impact your eligibility to apply for permanent status.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I
Yeah,
think
go ahead.
I think if my client, for example, was traveling abroad, had DACA, was traveling abroad to apply for their work visa at a consulate abroad, their H-1B visa, for example, um, I would want to do everything in my power to help that person get advanced parole. Um, so that if they go to their consular appointment for their H-1B visa and for whatever reason the visa is denied, they would still have an opportunity to return to the US with advance parole. However, I can say that it is really, really, really hard to get that timing exactly the way it needs to be. Um, you don't often hear about your consular interview until maybe a couple weeks or a month or two in advance. The processing time for advanced parole applications is longer than a couple of weeks or a couple months. So it's just very hard to do. At the same time, I think, the goal of the President Biden's statement on June 18th is to more or less have everything lined up for these employment-based visas as quickly as possible so that it's kind of in and out. So you're heading out of the US, doing your interview, getting approved, and coming back in as quickly as possible. But there is still, inherent risk in traveling abroad, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's right. Um, This is a tough one. Uh, do we know how this will interact for individuals who have been told that they have the permanent bar?
So, generally speaking, if you have the permanent bar, you are, in most scenarios, probably not eligible for permanent residency, unfortunately. Um, and sort of the whole purpose of parole in place is to give you the lawful entry that you need to be eligible for permanent residency here in the US. Um, so if you have the permanent bar, and let me take a step back, I'm sorry. The permanent bar typically means that you entered the US, you were here for more than 1 year without permission, you left the US, and then within 10 years, you return to the US without permission. So you entered, you stayed for more than a year without permission, you left, and then a few years later, less than 10 years later, you return to the United States, and at that second entry, you entered without permission. Then you have something called the permanent bar, which what we commonly call the permanent bar. That's not the official name, but you have the permanent bar. And unfortunately, what that means is you're not eligible for permanent residency until you have left the US, you've waited outside of the United States for 10 years, and then you have applied for a waiver or a pardon of, sort of the remainder of the permanent bar. So I don't know if having the permanent bar would prevent you from applying for the parole in place that is from the June 18th announcement. Um, I can't answer that yet, but what I can tell you is that even if you applied for parole in place and even if it was approved, if you have the permanent bar, ultimately you are probably still not eligible for permanent residency, unless you meet the criteria for the pardon of the permanent bar.
Okay. There's another series of questions about if there is a change in presidency, do we think even if this program starts that it could be taken away?
Um,
I know that's a hard question because we don't know exactly how the program would start, but
right. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's pure speculation, right? If there is a change in presidency, I think meaning President Trump wins the election in November and comes back into power as president on January 20th of next year. I mean, I don't want to speculate what he would or would not do, but I think just based on the previous Trump administration and his recent rhetoric, I think there's a reasonable chance that he would potentially stop this program if it went into effect. Yes, I think so. Again, can't say for sure, but I think it's the best guess.
sadly, that is true. There's a number of questions about advanced parole and how that interacts with DACA. It's related, but slightly off topic. Would you mind spending a few minutes talking about DACA advanced parole, why that's a benefit? And then to the series of questions about specifically what qualifies for advanced parole, how you would apply. I really encourage you to sign up for the individual consultations, as those are hard to answer in a group setting because they're very case specific. But generally, can you just explain what advanced parole is and why that's a benefit for either DACA or TPS holders?
Sure. Yeah, so advanced parole generally is permission from the US government for temporary travel outside of the US. Um, and to be allowed back in to resume whatever previous status you had. Advanced parole generally is available to people with all types of pending applications, including pending asylum applications, pending permanent residency applications, all sorts of situations. Specifically for DACA holders, advanced parole is a possibility if the foreign travel is related to one of three reasons. So it's related to an educational reason. So like the most common, I think, is that somebody is going to study abroad. And they have DACA and they want to be able to go abroad and study for a quarter or semester or whatever, and then return to the US and resume their DACA. The second reason is that the travel is related to an employment reason. So I think if you're, I don't know, going abroad to meet with clients or attend a training or a conference or something. And then the third reason is that the travel is related to a humanitarian purpose. The most common that's a very broad category, a humanitarian purpose. I think the most common one that we see is that somebody is going abroad to visit a sick relative, uh, an elderly grandparent who is, in a medical situation. Um, so if a person is married to a US citizen, generally they're eligible to apply for a green card in a relatively quick manner. But they're only eligible to apply for a green card here in the US based on that US citizen spouse if their last entry to the United States was lawful. So they legally entered, were admitted, or were paroled to the United States. If you are not in that scenario, so if your last entry to the US was without permission, then advanced parole can be a huge benefit to you, because you can travel abroad and then return to the United States, and now you have a lawful entry. And the moment you set foot in the US, you've been paroled in with your advanced parole document, and you have a US citizen spouse, you are probably immediately eligible to apply for your permanent residency. But there are no guarantees with advanced parole. It's ultimately up to the Border Patrol officer whether you are going to be allowed back in. So there is inherent risk in traveling abroad, even if you have an advanced parole document approved that's in your pocket. Similarly for TPS, there is no advanced parole for TPS, but there is something called a TPS travel document, which is very similar to advanced parole. And it serves the same purpose, that you can travel abroad and then you return, and now you have a lawful entry, and you could potentially apply for your green card, your permanent residency, through your US citizen loved one.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes and many wonderful questions that I have also noted, so we can include them in future briefings as we're having them. There's a series of questions about I think we have time for about 3 more questions. So one of them is, if you have DACA and you apply for an H-1B, can you also continue to renew your DACA?
Um,
I can help answer it if needed, because we recently looked into it. It would be
yeah,
helpful.
why don't you take it?
I can take it. So unfortunately, once your H-1B is approved, your DACA terminates. We learned recently. So you do have to make a choice at that point. I think this is really a delicate decision to make, and you really need to be working with a competent and experienced immigration attorney to make this decision for yourself. Particularly in light of the uncertainty around DACA, it might be the right decision for you, but it's really not one that anyone can give you general advice on.
Right.
But you can't hold both of those types of status at the same time. Okay, another question on it. Is let me think about this for a minute. I think we'll end on this one because it's come up a bunch. Does the announcement that Biden made do anything to move forward initial DACA applications that are still paused due to the DACA litigation? And then squeezing in a part B to that question, do we have any sense of the timing on when we'll have a decision on DACA?
Unfortunately, President Biden's announcement does not does not really impact people applying for initial DACA. What I will say is we don't know what the definition of other dreamers is. So again, maybe it will include people who have pending initial DACA applications. Maybe it will include people who meet the criteria for DACA but have not been able to apply because of the court decisions. I don't know, unfortunately. But practically speaking, the June 18th announcements did not say anything specific to initial DACA. In terms of court decision, I apologize, I did not update myself on where things lie with the court. But my understanding is the appeal is pending with the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the government and the Texas and whatever other states are currently in the process of finalizing their briefs, submitting their briefs to the court. We do expect that the court would grant oral argument at some point and then eventually issue a decision. We also expect that that decision would probably be appealed to the Supreme Court. But again, we don't know for sure. So I think there is still quite some time before there is a final decision on the current DACA litigation.
Yeah, that is exactly right. We're waiting on their briefing, and then I think it's hard to estimate these things, but most people believe there won't be a decision before next spring.
Yeah.
At the earliest on it. So again, not to sound like a broken record, but it's really critical you have an individual case assessment of all options available to you, both in light of this potential policy change, but just in general, given the uncertainty around DACA. Okay, thank you all so much for being with us. Alonso is gonna upload this and share out the recording. Again, this information is current as of today, June 21st, 2024. Should there be changes that come, we will hold another meeting. And then again, we just really encourage you to reach out and use the resources available to you. Not sure, Manoj, if there's anything else you want to say to close out.
Well, that's right. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll keep updating you as we get more information. So stay on the lookout.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.